The old black dress hung on me like a sack, the only decent thing I owned. And even then, decent was a stretch. It was a hand-me-down from Mama, from a time when she was a bit fuller. Now it just made me feel smaller, younger than my 17 years. Little Leo was snug in his carrier against my chest, his soft breaths warming my skin through the thin fabric. He was the only warmth I felt these days. My bus ride to the rich side of town was long, filled with the kind of stairs that made my skin prickle. A black girl, barely more than a child herself, with a baby strapped to her front, heading into the land of manicured lawns and towering houses. I knew what they were thinking. I'd thought it all myself 1,000 times. But today, I had to be brave for Mr. Harrison, Mr. Arthur Harrison. He'd been a regular at the downtown library where I worked part-time after school, before Leo came and school became a distant dream. He was old, with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners and a shock of white hair that always looked like he'd just run his hands through it. He never looked down on me. Not once. Not when I was clumsy shelving books. Not when I was visibly pregnant and trying to hide it. Not even when I finally had to tell Mrs. Gable, the head librarian, that I couldn't work anymore. He'd find me in the quietest aisle, usually history or poetry, and he'd just talk. Not like I was some charity case, but like I was a person. He'd ask about my studies. I used to love history. And he'd listen, really listen when I told him about the complexities of the Peloponnesian War or the beauty of Langston Hughes. He'd nod, and sometimes he'd share a story from his own life, about traveling or a book he'd loved as a boy. When I stopped coming to work, he'd asked Mrs. Gable about me. She told me later, a little guilt in her voice, that she'd explained my situation. I'd cringed, expecting his kindness to curdle into pity or judgment. But a few days later, a small package arrived at our cramped apartment. Inside was a collection of poetry books, a soft knitted blanket for Leo, who wasn't even born yet, and a card. The card just said, "Keep reading, Maya, and never stop dreaming. Your friend, Arthur H." There was also a gift card to a grocery store, enough to keep us going for a couple of weeks. No lecture, no advice, just kindness. I'd cried then, big heaving sobs that shook my whole body. Mama had held me, stroking my hair, not saying anything. She knew. She knew how rare that kind of goodness was in our world. And now he was gone. The obituary in the paper, a paper I only saw because Mrs. Henderson next door used it to wrap her vegetable scraps, had his picture. The same kind eyes, the same unruly white hair. Prominent businessman and philanthropist Arthur Harrison passed away peacefully. It listed his accomplishments, his board memberships, his surviving family, a wife, 2 sons, several grandchildren. Grandchildren who probably had everything I didn't. I had to go. I owed him that much. Even if I stuck out like a sore thumb, even if his rich family looked at me like I was dirt on their expensive shoes, I had to say goodbye. The funeral home was grander than any building I'd ever been in, apart from maybe the Central Library downtown. Marble floors, high ceilings, hushed voices, and the heavy scent of lilies. So many lilies. I felt my cheap dress and worn-out flats even more keenly here. Leo stirred against me, and I patted his back gently, whispering, "Shh, baby, it's okay. We just here to say thank you to a nice man." People were dressed in dark, expensive-looking clothes. Women with perfect hair and subtle jewelry, men in sharp suits. They glanced at me, a quick flicker of surprise, then dismissal. I could feel the unspoken questions hanging in the air. Who is she? What is she doing here? My heart pounded in my chest like a trapped bird. I wanted to turn around, to run back to the familiarity of my neighborhood, where my struggles were at least understood, even if they weren't shared. But then I remembered Mr. Harrison's eyes, the way he'd smiled when I'd finally understood a difficult passage he'd pointed out. He'd seen something in me. I couldn't let that memory down. I found a seat at the very back, near a large fern, hoping to be invisible. Leo was starting to fuss a little, probably hungry. I prayed he wouldn't start wailing. I bounced him gently, humming a soft tune, my eyes scanning the room. At the front, near a closed casket draped in more flowers, sat a woman with silver hair, elegant even in her grief. That must be Mrs. Harrison. Beside her were two men who looked like older versions of the photos I'd sometimes seen in Mr. Harrison's wallet when he'd taken it out to show me a picture of a bird he'd seen, or a landmark from a trip. His sons. The service began. A minister spoke about Mr. Harrison's generosity, his business acumen, his love for his family. Then one of his sons got up, his voice thick with emotion, and shared memories of fishing trips and long talks. It all sounded so perfect. A perfect life, a perfect family. I felt a fresh wave of inadequacy wash over me. What was my small, almost secret friendship with him compared to all this? Maybe I shouldn't have come. But then the son mentioned Mr. Harrison's love for books, for learning, for helping young people find their way. He said, Dad believed everyone deserved a chance, a guiding hand. He had a soft spot for underdogs, for those who the world often overlooked. My breath caught in my throat. He was talking about people like me. When the formal service ended, people started to file past the casket, then to offer condolences to the family. My palms were sweating. This was the moment. Go up or slip away. Leo was getting restless, his little whimpers growing louder. I knew I didn't have much time. Taking a deep breath, I stood up, my legs feeling like jelly. I clutched Leo a little tighter, as if he could lend me some of his innocent courage. I walked slowly, deliberately, towards the front. The murmuring in the room seemed to quieten as I approached. I could feel every eye on me. I kept my gaze fixed on Mrs. Harrison. She looked up as I got closer, her eyes red-rimmed but clear. There was a flicker of something. Confusion? Annoyance? I couldn't tell. The two sons flanked her, their expressions unreadable, a little wary. I stopped a few feet away. My voice, when it finally came, was barely a whisper. Mrs. Harrison? I'm Maya. I knew Mr. Harrison from the library. He was very kind. To me. A polite, strained smile touched her lips. Thank you for coming, dear, she said, her voice quiet and cultured. It was a dismissal, polite but firm. The kind you give to a stranger you won't see again. My heart sank. This was it. I'd done what I came to do. I should just leave. I nodded, tears pricking my eyes. He was a good man, I managed, my voice trembling. I started to turn away. Leo, as if sensing my distress, or maybe just because he was a baby and his timing was impeccable, let out a small, distinct wail. Not a full-blown scream, but enough to make everyone nearby look. I blushed, mortified. I'm so sorry, I stammered, trying to soothe him, jiggling him gently. He's usually so good. We should go. I fumbled with his carrier, ready to flee. But then a hand, surprisingly strong, touched my arm. It was Mrs. Harrison. She had risen from her seat and stepped towards me, her eyes no longer distant but focused, searching. She was looking at Leo, really looking at him. Her expression changed. The polite mask crumbled, replaced by something raw, something unreadable. She stared at Leo, then at me, then back at Leo. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. The murmurs around us died completely. It felt like the whole world was holding its breath. One of the sons stepped forward, a protective look on his face. Mother, are you all right? Mrs. Harrison didn't seem to hear him. Her gaze was locked on Leo. She reached out a trembling hand, almost as if to touch his face, then hesitated. Her eyes welled up, and a single tear traced a path down her powdered cheek. Then she looked directly at me, her voice so low I could barely hear it, but it cut through the silence of the room like a bell. It was just one word. David. My blood ran cold. David. Who was David? My mind raced. Was it one of her sons? No, they were older, Robert and James, the obituary had said. A grandson? Why would she call my Leo David? I must have looked utterly bewildered. I don't understand, I whispered. His name is Leo. Mrs. Harrison shook her head slowly, her eyes still wide, still fixed on Leo, but now with a dawning, almost painful understanding. No, I mean, he looks so much like my David, my son, Arthur's first son. A collective gasp seemed to ripple through the closest onlookers. Her other sons exchanged shocked, confused glances. David? One of them, Robert, I thought, said. Mother, David. David died before he was even your age, Maya. He looked at me, then back at his mother, a gentle concern in his voice. He died a baby. Mrs. Harrison wasn't listening to him. She was looking at me, really looking at me. A storm of emotions playing across her face. Grief, shock, and a fragile, burgeoning hope that terrified me. My David, she repeated, her voice trembling. He had your eyes, she said to me. Your chin. Arthur always said he saw David in so many young faces, but this... She gestured towards Leo, who had quieted now, his big brown eyes curiously watching this tearful woman. This is uncanny. The shape of his head, his little mouth. She took another step closer, and this time her hand did reach out, tentatively touching Leo's soft cheek. Leo, surprisingly, didn't flinch. He gurgled. Arthur. Arthur never got over losing David, she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. It was before Robert and James were born. A crib death. It nearly broke him. He carried that grief his whole life. She looked back at me, her eyes searching mine. Your name is Maya, you said? And you knew Arthur from the library? I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. The entire room was silent, watching this strange, intense drama unfold. I felt naked, exposed. Leo a vulnerable bundle in my arms. Did he ever speak of a son named David? She asked, her voice urgent. I shook my head. No, ma'am. He mostly talked about books, about my future. He encouraged me. My voice cracked. He gave me books for Leo. One of the sons, James, the quieter one, spoke up. Mother, this is a lot. Perhaps we should discuss this privately. He gave me a look that wasn't unkind, just overwhelmed. But Mrs. Harrison seemed to have found a sudden strength. No, she said, her voice clearer now. Arthur brought this young woman into our lives, in his own way. He saw something. He always did. She looked back at me, a new intensity in her gaze. Tell me about yourself, Maya. Please. And so, right there, in the hushed opulence of the funeral home, with Mr. Harrison's casket a silent witness, I found myself telling my story. Not the edited version, but the raw, honest truth. About getting pregnant, about Leo's father disappearing the moment he found out, about dropping out of school, about Mama working 2 jobs just to keep our heads above water, about the fear and the loneliness, and about Mr. Harrison's unexpected, unwavering kindness. I told them about the poetry books, the grocery gift card, the soft blanket. Small things to a family like theirs, perhaps, but they had been lifelines to me. As I spoke, I saw the expressions on their faces change. The wariness in the son's eyes softened into something like dawning respect, tinged with sadness. Mrs. Harrison listened intently, her gaze never leaving mine, except to occasionally glance at Leo with that same heartbroken, hopeful expression. When I finished, my voice hoarse, a different kind of silence fell. Not the shocked silence from before, but a thoughtful, contemplative one. Mrs. Harrison finally broke it. "Arthur had a photograph," she said softly, almost to herself. A tiny, faded one of David. He kept it in his wallet behind his driver's license. He said it was his private reminder. She looked at Robert. "Do you have his wallet, dear?" Robert nodded, looking a little dazed. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. With trembling fingers, Mrs. Harrison opened it, fumbling behind a plastic slot. She pulled out a tiny creased black and white photograph. It was a picture of a baby, no more than a few months old, with wide dark eyes and a tuft of dark hair. She held it out, her hand shaking. "Look," she whispered. I leaned closer, my heart pounding. Robert and James peered over her shoulder. The resemblance was undeniable. Leo had the same wide, solemn eyes, the same curve of the cheek, the same little Cupid's bow mouth. It was like looking at a ghost or a promise. "My God," Robert breathed. He really does." James just stared, speechless. Mrs. Harrison looked from the photograph to Leo, then to me. "Arthur must have seen it," she said, a note of awe in her voice. "He must have known, or at least suspected. Why else would he seek you out, Maya? Why else be so invested?" I had no answer. Could it be true? Could Mr. Harrison, in his quiet, gentle way, have recognized a long-lost piece of his own heart in me, in my son? It seemed too fantastical, too much like a movie. "But how?" James finally asked, voicing the question that hung in the air. David didn't have any... this would mean..." Mrs. Harrison was looking at me, a strange, piercing look. "Maya," she said gently. "Your mother, what is her name? Did she ever know our family? Did she ever know Arthur, a long time ago?" My mind spun. Mama? Mama had grown up in this city too. She was a few years younger than Mr. Harrison would have been in his youth. Could there be a connection I never knew about? Mama never talked much about her past, about my father, about the years before I was born. It was a closed book, filled with hurt she didn't want to revisit. "My mother's name is Sarah," I said slowly. "Sarah Johnson. She doesn't talk about her early life much. I don't know my father. She never told me his name." A new, sharper silence fell. Mrs. Harrison's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. She exchanged a look with her sons, a look I couldn't decipher, but it was heavy with unspoken meaning. "Sarah Johnson," Mrs. Harrison repeated softly. She closed her eyes for a moment as if searching her memory. When she opened them, they were filled with a profound sadness and something else. Recognition? "Arthur. Before we were married," she began, her voice faltering. "He was engaged to someone else, a young woman. It was a long time ago. A youthful romance. Her name was Sarah. Sarah Jenkins then, I think." She looked at me, her gaze unwavering. "He told me about her once, many years ago. He said she broke it off suddenly. He never knew why. He was heartbroken at the time." The implications hit me like a physical blow. If Mr. Harrison had been engaged to a Sarah Jenkins, who later became Sarah Johnson, and if that Sarah was my mother, then Mr. Harrison... No, it couldn't be. My legs felt weak. I might have swayed because Robert the son gently took my elbow. "Easy there," he said, his voice surprisingly kind. "Could it be possible?" Mrs. Harrison whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. "Could Arthur have found his granddaughter without even truly knowing?" She looked at Leo, then at me, her eyes filled with a dizzying mix of grief for her lost son David, grief for her husband, and a new, unbelievable dawning possibility. The one word she had spoken, David, hadn't just been about a resemblance. It had been a key, unlocking a door to a past I never knew existed, a past that Mr. Harrison himself might have only glimpsed at the very end of his life. It wasn't that Leo was the reincarnation of their lost child. It was that Leo, and by extension, me, might be the continuation of a lineage they thought had ended. A lineage connected to Arthur through a love he thought was lost to time. If my mother was the Sarah he had known, then Arthur Harrison wasn't just a kind old man from the library. He was my grandfather, and Leo was his great-grandson. The realization was so immense, so world-altering, that I couldn't process it. Me, Maya, from the wrong side of the tracks, with a baby and no prospects, related to this wealthy, respected family? It was impossible. I need to sit down, I mumbled. Robert guided me to a nearby chair, one of the plush velvet ones I'd been too intimidated to even look at earlier. James brought a glass of water. Mrs. Harrison sat beside me, still clutching the tiny photograph of baby David. She took my free hand, her touch surprisingly warm. "Maya," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "We don't know anything for certain, yet." But Arthur? Arthur was a good man, a man of deep feeling. If he saw something in you, in Leo, he wouldn't have done it lightly. She paused, then continued. He changed his will a few weeks ago. It was very sudden. He just said he was making provisions for someone who deserved a chance. He didn't say who. We thought it was for one of his charities. Her eyes searched mine again. Could it have been for you, Maya? Did he know more than he let on? I shook my head, bewildered. I don't know. He never said anything like that. He listened. He gave me books. He told me I was smart. The simplicity of it sounded almost foolish in the face of this enormous unfolding mystery. Sometimes, Mrs. Harrison said softly, a wistful smile on her lips. That's all it takes. Someone to see you. She squeezed my hand. We need to talk to your mother, Maya, if she's willing. My mother. How would I even begin to explain this to her? She was a proud woman, private. If this story was true, she'd kept it hidden for my entire life, for reasons I couldn't begin to guess. The rest of the funeral proceedings passed in a blur. People still came to offer condolences, but their eyes kept flicking to me, to Leo, to the strange tableau we formed with the grieving Harrison family. The whispers were louder now, curious, speculative. Mrs. Harrison didn't let go of my hand. It was as if she was afraid I'd disappear. Her sons, Robert and James, hovered nearby, their initial shock giving way to a kind of protective concern, both for their mother and, surprisingly, for me and Leo. When it was time to leave for the burial, Mrs. Harrison turned to me. Will you come with us, Maya? To the cemetery? And then perhaps back to the house. We need to talk. All of us. I looked at Leo, sleeping peacefully now against my chest, oblivious to the earthquake that had just ripped through my life. I thought of Mr. Harrison, the kind old man who had seen me, truly seen me, in the dusty aisles of the library. If this was his final gift, this unbelievable, terrifying, hopeful possibility, then I had to see it through. Yes, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. Yes, we'll come. The ride to the cemetery was in a long black limousine. Me, a teenage mother in a borrowed dress, sitting beside a grieving widow who might be my grandmother-in-law, or something. Even closer, it was surreal. Robert sat opposite us, occasionally offering a small, reassuring smile. James drove with his own family in the car behind. At the graveside, standing under a gray, weeping sky, I felt a profound sense of connection to the man being laid to rest. Not just as a benefactor, but as family? The word still felt too big, too foreign. But as I watched Mrs. Harrison drop, a single white rose onto the casket, her face etched with a lifetime of love and loss. I felt a pang of shared grief that went deeper than just sympathy. Later at the Harrison house, a mansion really, filled with art and antiques and quiet, sorrowful elegance, we sat in a sun-filled study. Leo was asleep in a magnificent antique bassinet that Mrs. Harrison had insisted on bringing down from the attic, her eyes shining with unshed tears as she did so. It was David's, she'd whispered, and then Robert's, and James's. My mother arrived an hour later, her face a mixture of confusion and anxiety. I'd called her from the limousine, my explanation garbled and rushed. "Mama, they think Mr. Harrison might be my grandfather." Now, sitting opposite Mrs. Harrison, my mother looked small and vulnerable, but there was a defensive set to her jaw. Mrs. Harrison was gentle. She spoke of Arthur, of his kindness, of his brief engagement to a Sarah Jenkins all those years ago. She didn't accuse, didn't demand. She just laid out the pieces, her voice soft with grief and a fragile hope. Mama listened, her face pale. For a long time she said nothing. Then she looked at me, her eyes filled with a pain I'd never seen before. "It's true," she whispered, the words barely audible. "Arthur Harrison was your father, Maya." The room fell silent. The only sound was Leo's soft breathing from the bassinet. Mama's story tumbled out, fragmented and tearful. She and Arthur had been young, deeply in love. Her parents hadn't approved. He was from a wealthier family, a different world. They'd put pressure on her, threatened to disown her. Scared and confused, she'd broken off the engagement, telling Arthur she didn't love him anymore. A lie that had haunted her ever since. She hadn't known then that she was pregnant with me. By the time she realized, Arthur had moved on, was engaged to Eleanor, the woman now sitting opposite her. Ashamed and proud, Sarah had decided to raise me on her own, never telling Arthur, never wanting to disrupt his new life, his new happiness. She'd changed her last name to Johnson, her mother's maiden name, to further erase the past. "I never wanted to be a burden or a scandal," Mama choked out, tears streaming down her face. "He deserved to be happy. And you," she looked at me, "you deserved more than a life overshadowed by my mistakes." Mrs. Harrison reached across and took Mama's hand. "Oh, my dear Sarah," she said, her own eyes wet. "All those years, all that heartache for both of you. Arthur, he never truly forgot you. He carried a sadness, a question mark, about you for a long time." She looked at me, then at Leo. "And now, this. A miracle in the midst of all this sorrow." Robert and James, who had listened in stunned silence, now looked at me with new eyes. Not just as a stranger their father had helped, but as family. Their half-sister, albeit unknowingly. The word Mr. Harrison had never said, the truth he might have only begun to uncover before he died, was now laid bare. His kindness hadn't been random. It had been an echo of a lost love, a pull towards his own blood, a whisper from his soul recognizing mine. The one word Mrs. Harrison had spoken at the funeral, "David," prompted by a resemblance, had been the catalyst. It hadn't been the final answer, but it had shattered the silence, broken down the walls of secrets and time, and led us to this moment of painful, beautiful truth. Everything had changed. My past, my present, Leo's future. The weight of the world, the shame of being a young, single mother, the constant struggle. It didn't disappear, but it shifted. It was now part of a larger story, a more complex story. A story that included a grandfather I'd never known, but who had, in his own way, found me. A story that included a new, unexpected family. There were still so many questions, so many emotions to process. But as I looked at my son, sleeping peacefully in his great-uncle David's bassinet, and then at my mother, finding a fragile comfort in Mrs. Harrison's understanding presence, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope. Mr. Harrison's funeral had been the end of his life, but for me, and for Leo, it was a beginning. A beginning forged in grief and surprise, but a beginning nonetheless. The one word that had pierced the polite facade of the funeral had not just been a name, but a question, a possibility, a bridge across generations. And it had, indeed, changed everything. In the weeks that followed, life settled into a new, almost unbelievable rhythm. Mrs. Harrison, Eleanor, she insisted I call her, along with Robert and James, embraced us with a warmth that was both astonishing and deeply healing. There were no grand pronouncements to the wider world, no dramatic public acknowledgments. It was all handled with a quiet dignity that I realized was very much like Mr. Harrison himself. The provisions he'd made in his will were indeed for me and Leo, enough to ensure I could go back to school, that Leo would have everything he needed, that Mama wouldn't have to work herself to the bone anymore. It wasn't just about money, though. It was about opportunity, the kind Mr. Harrison had always believed everyone deserved. Mama and Eleanor formed an unlikely bond, two women who had loved the same man at different points in his life, now connected by his legacy and by me, his daughter, and Leo, his grandson. They would sit for hours, sharing stories of Arthur, filling in the gaps in each other's knowledge, sometimes laughing, sometimes crying. It was a catharsis for both of them. Robert and James, my half-brothers, were kind and welcoming, if a little awkward at first. They had their own families, their own lives, but they made space for me, for Leo. Their children, my nieces and nephews, were fascinated by their new baby cousin and their surprise aunt. Suddenly, Leo had a whole tribe. I started college courses, online slowly at first, juggling studies with caring for Leo. History, just as Mr. Harrison had encouraged. I often felt him there with me, a gentle presence, when I was hunched over my books late at night, Leo asleep in his crib beside my desk. The crib was a gift from Eleanor, not the antique one, but a sturdy new one, a symbol of new beginnings. Eleanor would often come over to our small apartment, which she was gently trying to persuade us to leave for something bigger, something in a better neighborhood. Mama and I were hesitant. This was our home, however humble. But Eleanor wasn't pushy. She'd just bring groceries, or little outfits for Leo, or simply sit and hold him, her eyes soft with a grandmother's love. One afternoon, she found me struggling with a particularly dense history text. "Your father would have loved this," she said, picking up the book. He always said history wasn't just about dates and battles, but about understanding people, their motivations, their heartbreaks, their triumphs. She then told me more about Arthur's fascination with lineage and connection, how he'd spent years idly tracing his own family tree, not out of snobbery, but out of a deep curiosity about how lives intertwined across generations. "Perhaps," she mused, looking at Leo who was batting at a mobile above his playmat. "He felt your connection on some intuitive level long before he could ever have guessed the truth. Maybe that's why he was drawn to you in the library, Maya, like a homing." Pigeon? The idea was comforting, that our bond hadn't just been a random act of kindness from him, but something deeper, something fated. The one word, David, had been the key, but it was Arthur's quiet, consistent actions that had laid the groundwork. His gentle inquiries at the library, his non-judgmental listening, the poetry books, the blanket, the gift card. Each was a breadcrumb leading to a truth he himself may only have started to suspect. He hadn't lived to see it fully revealed, but he had set the stage. I learned that Mr. Harrison, Arthur, as I slowly started to think of him, my father, had indeed begun some quiet inquiries after I stopped working at the library. He'd spoken to Mrs. Gable more than once, piecing together bits about my life, my mother's name. Eleanor believed he'd been on the cusp of understanding, perhaps even planning to reach out to my mother when he fell ill for the last time. His change of will was his way of ensuring that, even if his suspicions weren't confirmed, the young woman from the library who reminded him so much of someone, and whose son bore an uncanny resemblance to his lost child, would be cared for. It wasn't a fairy tale. There were still awkward moments, still the feeling of being an outsider in this new, wealthier world. Some of the extended Harrison family were polite but distant, unsure what to make of this sudden addition. The stares I'd gotten on the bus were sometimes mirrored, more subtly at family gatherings. But Eleanor, Robert, and James were a constant, unwavering shield of acceptance. And for me, the biggest change was internal. The shame I'd carried for so long, the feeling of being less than, began to fade. I was still Maya, the girl who'd grown up poor, the teen mom. But now, I was also Maya, Arthur Harrison's daughter. Not because of his money or status, but because of a connection that ran deeper than circumstance. I had a history, a lineage I hadn't known, and it grounded me in a new way. Leo, of course, was oblivious to it all. He just knew he was surrounded by people who loved him, who cooed over him and showered him with affection. He'd grin his gummy smile at Eleanor, pull Robert's hair, and drool happily on James's expensive shirts. He was the bridge, the innocent link between past hurts and future hopes. One day, about a year after the funeral, Eleanor took me and Mama to the cemetery. We stood before Arthur's grave, the three women who had loved him in different ways. The stone was simple, elegant. Arthur Harrison, beloved husband, father, grandfather. Eleanor had recently added a small new line at the bottom. It read, "And great-grandfather." She squeezed my hand. He knows, Maya. I believe he knows. And I think he's at peace, more than he ever was in life, knowing his family is complete. I looked at the stone, the heavy weight of the word father finally settling into my heart, not as a shock, but as a quiet truth. I thought of the man in the library, his kind eyes, his gentle encouragement. He hadn't needed to know I was his daughter to be good to me. His kindness had been innate. But discovering the truth had given that kindness a profound new dimension. It had been the love of a father, reaching out across years of silence and separation, finding its way home. The one word, David, spoken in a moment of shocked recognition at a funeral, had indeed changed everything. It had unraveled a lifetime of secrets, healed old wounds, and woven a new family tapestry, stronger and more beautiful for its unexpected threads. And in the center of it all was love, lost, found, and ultimately enduring. My son Leo would grow up knowing that love, knowing his story, a story that began not in shame, but in a moment of profound, life-altering connection at a rich man's funeral. And I, Maya, was no longer just a black teen with a baby. I was a daughter, a sister, a mother, and a part of something much bigger than I could ever have dreamed. And I was finally, truly, okay.